She didn't knock. She couldn't wait. Eliza Carter threw herself off her horse in the freezing dark, ran straight to his door, and pounded with both fists until her knuckles bled. When Nathaniel Brooks opened it tall, silent, a lantern in his hand, she grabbed his coat and looked him dead in the eyes. "Marry me," she gasped, "before it's too late." He stared at her. Rain soaked her hair. Her hands were shaking. And then the quietest man in all of Wyoming said the one word she never expected. Yes. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Eliza Carter rode to Nathaniel Brooks's ranch, she had already lost everything else. Not the land. Not yet. But she had lost the banker's patience. She had lost the lawyer's confidence. She had lost 3 neighbors who refused to get involved, one after another, each man shaking his head at her kitchen table before standing up and reaching for his hat. She had lost sleep for 11 straight days. She had lost the ability to cry, which frightened her more than anything, because crying meant you still believed something could hurt you. And Eliza had moved past that into a cold, hollow place where only one question remained. What else can I do? She was 27 years old. Her father had been dead for 14 months. The ranch, 430 acres of hard-won Wyoming land that her father Thomas Carter had spent 30 years building, was about to be taken from her by a man named Gerald Holt through a legal mechanism so quietly constructed that her own lawyer had looked at the documents and gone pale. It's a lien provision buried in a mineral rights amendment. Attorney Philip Crane had told her 4 days ago, spreading papers across his desk with the defeated look of a man announcing a funeral. Filed in 1881. Your father may not have fully understood what he was signing. He understood everything he signed, Eliza said. Miss Carter. Crane cleared his throat. The fact remains that under territorial law, if Holt can prove the provision was legally executed, and the court accepts his interpretation of the amendment's scope, then by Thursday's hearing. I know what happens Thursday, she said quietly. She had read every document herself, 3 times. She understood exactly what Thursday meant. It meant Gerald Holt would walk out of that courthouse with legal claim to the water rights on the northern quarter of her property, and once those water rights transferred, the cattle operation became impossible to sustain, and once the cattle failed, the banknote would come due, and once the banknote came due, the ranch was gone. Simple as that. Her father's life. Gone. Is there anything, she said, anything at all that changes the legal standing? Crane looked at her over his spectacles. A few things could complicate Holt's claim. A legal dispute involving a registered married couple and shared property rights might create standing to challenge the amendment's application. But you would need a husband, she said flatly. He blinked. It's one avenue, a long shot, frankly. But it could potentially. She stood up and took her papers back from his desk. Thank you, Mr. Crane. She walked out of his office and stood on the wooden sidewalk in Casper, Wyoming in the autumn cold, and she did something she had not done in 14 months. She let herself feel how alone she was. Not for long. 3 breaths, maybe 4. Then she started thinking. She had asked 3 men. 3 perfectly reasonable options men. She knew men who respected her father. Men who might have seen the logic in a practical arrangement. Each one had said no. The first was afraid of Holt's influence. The second had a quietly complicated situation with another woman. The third, and this was the one that had burned the most, had looked at her with something she could only call pity and said, Eliza, I like you fine. But I'm not about to go to war with Gerald Holt over somebody else's land. Her father's grave was less than a mile from the house. She rode home in silence and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, not eating, not reading, just turning through names in her mind, the way you sort through old coins, holding each one up to the light, testing its weight, putting it back down. And then quietly, like something surfacing from deep water, one name came up. Nathaniel Brooks. She sat very still. She barely knew the man. That was the honest truth. He was 13 years older than her. He was a widower. His wife Clara had died of fever 6 years ago, And from what Eliza understood, he had not been the same since. He kept to himself. Ran a clean operation out on the northwest side of the county, maybe 8 miles from her property line. She had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in her life, and most of those conversations had been short enough to count on one hand. But there was something she knew about Nathaniel Brooks that she did not know about any other man she had considered. 2 years before her father died, Thomas Carter had come home one evening with a strange expression on his face. He sat down at the table and poured himself a glass of water and didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said, "You know that contract Holtzman was pushing me to sign last spring, the grazing rights agreement?" Eliza had remembered it. There had been pressure, subtle, persistent pressure to sign over a portion of the grazing access in exchange for what Holt's representative kept calling a fair development consideration. "You never signed it," she said. "No," her father said. "I never signed it because Nathaniel Brooks came to me one Sunday morning and asked me very quietly not to." He paused. "He told me there was something wrong with the language in that agreement. Said he'd had a lawyer look at it. Said if I signed it, I'd be giving away more than I understood." "He did that," Eliza said, "on his own. Never asked for a thing in return," her father said. "Just told me the truth and let me decide." He looked at his water glass. "That's a rare kind of man, Eliza. You don't forget something like that." Eliza hadn't forgotten it. She sat at the kitchen table at 9:30 on a Wednesday night, with Thursday's hearing less than 12 hours away, and she made a decision. She was going to ride 8 miles in the dark and the cold to ask a man she barely knew to marry her before morning. If he said no, she had nothing left. If he said yes. She didn't let herself finish the thought. She just stood up, put on her coat, and walked to the barn. The ride felt longer than 8 miles. The cold had teeth that night. November in Wyoming had a way of making you feel like the landscape itself was hostile. The wind coming down off the mountains with a kind of mean persistence, the darkness so complete that her horse. Juniper moved mostly on instinct, while Eliza bent forward in the saddle and tried to keep her hands from going numb. She talked to herself during that ride. She did it quietly under her breath, the way she had done since childhood, when she was trying to hold herself together. "You are going to say your piece clearly," she told herself. "You are not going to cry. You are not going to beg. You are going to explain the situation, offer him a fair arrangement, and let him make his choice." A minute later, "He is going to say no." Another minute, "It doesn't matter. You still have to ask." She almost turned back twice. The first time was when Juniper stumbled on a frozen rut in the road, and Eliza's heart lurched so hard she lost her breath. And for one long moment in the dark, she thought, "This is ridiculous. This is humiliating. This is not who you are." She kept riding. The second time was when she crested the low hill that looked down toward Nathaniel's property and saw the light still burning in the main house window, and the sight of it, that single warm rectangle of light in all that dark, hit her somewhere unexpected. She pulled Juniper to a stop and just sat there for a moment looking at it. A light in the window meant someone was still awake. Someone was in there, living their life unbothered and whole, and she was about to knock on that door and drag them into her disaster. "You don't have to do this," something in her said. But she knew the other side of that. She knew what came after "you don't have to do this." She had stood at her father's land, looked at the papers, and done that math too many times. She knew what the ranch looked like without water rights. She knew what the banknote said. She rode down the hill. "Die." She did not knock gently. She was not in the condition for gentleness. By the time she reached his porch, her hands were so cold she could barely feel them, and the combination of adrenaline and exhaustion, and something that was close to despair, had stripped away whatever composure she'd rehearsed on the road. She hit the door with the side of her fist 3 times hard, the way you knock when you're not sure you'll have the courage to knock again. Then she heard footsteps. Heavy, unhurried footsteps. The kind that belonged to a man who had never needed to rush toward anything in his life. The door opened. Nathaniel Brooks was taller than she remembered. He stood in the doorway holding a kerosene lantern at shoulder height, and the light fell across his face in a way that showed exactly what he was: a man who had seen a great deal of weather. Lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves pushed up, which told her he hadn't been asleep. He'd been doing something at his table. He looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately read. Not alarmed, not impatient, just looking. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, unhurried, like he saw no need to use more sound than the words required. "Mr. Brooks," she said. She had planned to lead with an explanation. She had rehearsed it on the road. "I apologize for the hour. I need to speak with you about a legal matter. I have a proposal that I believe could benefit us both." She said none of that. What came out instead was the truth stripped to its bones. "I need you to marry me," she said, "before tomorrow morning." He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't do any of the things men did when they were surprised. No eyebrows going up. No sharp intake of breath. None of it. He just looked at her steadily from behind the lantern light, and the seconds stretched out long enough that she started to hear her own heartbeat. Then he said, "You'd better come in." She expected him to question her immediately. Instead, he set the lantern on the table, moved a stack of papers to make room, and put a kettle on without asking. She stood in the middle of his kitchen, dripping melted frost onto his floor, watching him move around the space with the calm efficiency of a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He poured water into the kettle and set it over the stove, and then he turned around and leaned against the counter with his arms folded, and he looked at her with those quiet eyes, and he waited. She talked for 11 minutes. She told him about the lien provision and the mineral rights amendment. She told him about the Thursday hearing and Gerald Holt and the water rights. She told him what Crane had said about a married couple's legal standing. She told him she had asked 3 other men and been refused. She told him she understood this was an enormous imposition and that she had no right to ask it of him, and that she would understand completely if he said no. She said all of it plainly without decoration, looking at his face the whole time to read what was happening behind it. His expression did not change. Not once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to hiss. He turned, poured 2 cups, set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it, and then sat down across the table. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "How much time," he said quietly, "will this give you to fight?" She blinked. Of every question she had anticipated. "Why me? What do I get out of this? Do you understand what you're asking?" This had not been one of them. "The marriage would give me grounds to challenge the amendment's application on shared property," she said carefully. "It changes the legal standing enough that Crane believes we could at minimum force a delay. And a delay gives me time to find something better," Nathaniel said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. He turned his cup once in his hands. "I knew your father," he said. "I know," she said. He told me what you did." Nathaniel looked up at her. "The grazing contract," she said. 2 years ago. You warned him." Something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly, more like recognition. Like he was recalculating something. "He remembered that," Nathaniel said. "He remembered everything that mattered," Eliza said. "He was that kind of man." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the house and died away again. The fire in the stove ticked. "Miss Carter," Nathaniel said finally. "Eliza," she said. "If you're going to consider this, you can use my name." He looked at her. The faintest thing, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, crossed his face. "Eliza," he said, "I have some questions. Not about whether I'll do it. I've already decided that." She felt something crack open in her chest. She wasn't entirely sure what it was. "You what?" she said. "I said I'll do it." He said it the way he'd say the fence is fixed or the cattle are in. Matter of fact. Settled. Like it wasn't a remarkable thing. "But I want to understand what we're agreeing to. What the arrangement looks like. What you need from me, and what I'm promising to give." Eliza stared at him. In all her preparations for this conversation, all the refusals she had anticipated, all the negotiations she had planned, All the ways she had steeled herself against humiliation and desperation she had never once prepared for. Yes. Not a real yes. Not a calm, immediate, I've already decided yes from a man who hadn't known she was coming. You haven't even thought about it, she said. She didn't mean it as an accusation. It came out more like wonder. I've thought about it enough, he said. That's you can't know enough, she said. I just walked in here. You don't know if I'm telling you the truth. You don't know what Holt's capable of. You don't know what this... Eliza. He said her name again, and there was something about the way he said it not cutting her off, just anchoring her. Your father was a good man, a straight man. I know that because I watched him for years, and you are his daughter. He paused. I also know what Gerald Holt has been doing to families in this county. I know because I've been watching that too. She went very still. What does that mean? She said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table toward the stack of papers he had moved to the side when she came in. It means, he said, that you didn't just come to the right man for your legal standing. He set the papers in front of her. She looked down. They were documents, deeds, letters, property filings going back years, and beneath them, more papers covered in careful handwritten notes in a hand she didn't recognize. What is this? She whispered. That, Nathaniel said, is why I said yes. She sat at that table for an hour reading. He let her read in silence, which she appreciated more than she could say. He refilled her cup, once set it down without comment, and went back to his own chair, and he waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed to be absorbed quietly. What she was reading was not just paperwork. It was a record. A systematic, meticulous record of something that had been happening across Powder River County for at least 8 years. Property transactions that looked clean on the surface. Mineral rights amendments with buried provisions. Grazing agreements with clauses that expanded in scope 3 years after signing. A pattern so consistent and so deliberate that when you saw it laid out in front of you all in the same hand, all pointing in the same direction, there was only one word for it: scheme. Gerald Holt wasn't just after her father's land. He had been quietly dismantling ranch families across the county for a decade. How long have you been collecting this? She asked. 6 years, Nathaniel said. 6 years. She looked up from the documents. Why? Because I saw what happened to my neighbor Walt Pullman in 1881, he said. Lost his water access through exactly the kind of provision Holt is using against you now. Went out of business inside of 2 years. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have proof. So I started looking. You started looking, she repeated. By yourself, for 6 years. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, he said. I just knew somebody would need it eventually. She looked at him across the table. She had come to this man's door with nothing but a desperate proposal and a handful of legal documents. She had thought she was asking him to lend her his name for a courthouse fight. Instead, she had found she didn't have a word for it yet. She needed time to find the right word. These documents, she said, if they were presented at Thursday's hearing, they'd change the nature of the case, he said. It would stop being a dispute about one woman's property. It would become evidence of a pattern of fraud. Crane needs to see these tonight, she said. Nathaniel nodded. I know. Can I do you? She stopped, steadied herself. I'm asking a great deal of you. He looked at her steadily. You're asking me to stand beside something worth standing beside, he said. That's not a great deal. That's a reason to get up in the morning. Eliza Carter, who had not cried in 14 months, who had sat in 3 bankers' offices and 2 lawyers' chairs and 3 neighbors' kitchens, and held herself together through all of it, felt something happen behind her eyes that she did not try to stop. She pressed her lips together and looked at the documents in her hands. We should talk about the arrangement, she said. Her voice was mostly steady. What's fair to you? What you'd need? We'll figure that out, he said. He stood up and reached for his coat on the hook by the door. Right now, we need to get to Crane's house before midnight. She looked up at him. You're coming tonight, she said. The documents need to go with me if they're going to be useful, he said. He looked back at her over his shoulder. And I'm not letting you ride back out in this weather by yourself. She opened her mouth, closed it again. All right, she said. She stood up, gathered her coat, and followed the quietest man in Wyoming out into the cold November dark toward a courthouse battle. Neither of them had any guarantee of winning toward a marriage. Neither of them had planned toward something that was just beginning to take shape in the space between what they needed and what they were willing to become. She didn't know yet what that something was. But for the first time in 14 months, she wasn't carrying it alone. And that even before the courthouse, even before Thursday, even before any of it, that was enough to keep her moving forward. They rode side by side through the dark. Nathaniel on his big gray horse. Eliza on Juniper, the documents wrapped in oilcloth tucked into his saddlebag. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The wind had dropped, which was a mercy, and the cold had gone still and clear, and somewhere above the clouds there was a moon trying to push through. At the end of the first mile, Eliza said, "Why did you warn my father about the grazing contract?" Nathaniel thought about it for a moment. Not like he didn't know the answer, more like he was deciding whether it needed more words than its simplest form. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Most men don't," she said. "I know," he said. They rode on. "Are you afraid?" she asked. She didn't know why she asked it. It came out before she could weigh it. He considered that question too. "A little," he said. "Holt has money and influence, and he's been untouched for 8 years." He paused. "But I've been waiting 6 years to put those documents in front of someone with standing to use them. I'm more ready than I am afraid." She absorbed that. "I came to you because my father trusted you," she said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't random." He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. But she heard something in his voice, when he answered, that she would spend a long time turning over afterward. "I know," he said quietly. "And I want you to know, I would have helped you regardless of the legal arrangement. I just want that to be said between us." She looked at the side of his face in the dark. "Then why agree to marry me?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you deserve someone standing next to you," he said, "not just someone handing you documents through a fence." Eliza faced forward. She looked at the road ahead, dark, uncertain, cold, leading toward a fight she wasn't sure she could win. But she was not for the first time in a very long time alone on it. She touched her heels lightly to Juniper's sides. They rode toward morning. Philip Crane opened his door at 11:47 at night, wearing a robe and an expression that said he had been expecting bad news, just not quite this kind. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the oilcloth bundle under Nathaniel's arm. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider without saying a word, which told Eliza that whatever he thought about the situation, his instincts as a lawyer were already louder than his surprise. "You'd better both come in," he said. They sat in his study. Crane untied the oilcloth with hands that grew steadily slower as he worked through the pages. Slower, not from age, but from the kind of careful attention a man gives to something he cannot afford to misread. The fire in his study burned low. Eliza watched his face. Nathaniel sat with his elbows on his knees and said nothing. 10 minutes in, Crane set down a document and looked up. "Where did you get these?" he said. "I collected them," Nathaniel said. "Over how long?" 6 years. Crane looked at him the way you look at someone when you're revising your entire opinion of them in real time. 6 years, he said. "And you never brought them to anyone?" "I never had anyone with standing to use them," Nathaniel said. "I do now." Crane picked up another document. His jaw tightened. "This deed transfer from the Pullman property in 1882, this is the same provision structure, almost word for word. 7 others like it," Nathaniel said. "I have records going back to 1879. Crane set the papers down flat on his desk and pressed both palms against them like he was holding them still, and he stared at the wall for a moment. "This isn't a property dispute," he said quietly. "No," Nathaniel said. "It never was." Crane looked at Eliza. "You understand what this means for Thursday?" "Tell me," she said. "It means we walk into that courtroom with something entirely different from what Holt is expecting. Crane's voice had changed. The exhausted resignation she'd heard in his office 4 days ago was gone. Something had replaced it, something sharper. He's expecting a straightforward hearing on a lien provision. One woman, limited resources, no precedent. He will have his argument ready and his judge half convinced before we open our mouths. He paused. But if we introduce these documents as evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud, if we can establish that the amendment Holt is using against you was constructed using the same method as 7 other fraudulent instruments, then we're no longer arguing about your water rights. We're arguing about whether Gerald Holt has been committing fraud across this county for a decade. The room was very quiet. Can we do that? Eliza said. In the time we have. I'm going to be awake until dawn finding out, Crane said. I was already reaching for a pen. Then he stopped and looked between them both. The marriage, is that still the plan? Yes, Eliza said. Crane looked at Nathaniel. You understand what you're walking into. I do, Nathaniel said. Holt is not a man who accepts interference gracefully. I know what kind of man Holt is, Nathaniel said. There was nothing heated in his voice, just a flat, quiet certainty that was somehow more serious than anger. I've been watching him for 6 years. Crane looked at him for another long moment. Then he turned back to his papers and said, I'll need you both here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. We have 6 hours to build a case that should have taken 6 months. Eliza stood up. We'll be here. Outside on the street, she stopped walking and turned to Nathaniel. You should know, she said, that when I came to your door tonight, I was ready for you to say no. I had nothing to offer you. I still don't, not really. He looked at her. You offered me the chance to use 6 years of work, he said. That's not nothing. That's not why you said yes, she said. He held her gaze. No, he admitted. It's not. She waited. Your father came to me once, he said. About a year before he died. He wasn't feeling well. I think he already knew something was wrong, though he didn't say it. He asked me if anything happened to him to keep an eye out. He stopped. I told him I would. I should have done more than that. Eliza felt something move through her that she couldn't name. Grief and gratitude tangled together into something that had no clean shape. You're doing it now, she said. Not soon enough, he said. They stood there on that dark street in the cold, and there was something happening in the silence between them. Something neither of them had the language for yet, because it was too new, and the night was too urgent, and there was a hearing in less than 8 hours that might determine the rest of both their lives. Come on, she finally said. I need to get back to the ranch. I have documents of my own to pull together. I'll ride with you, he said. You don't have to, Eliza. He said her name with the same quiet patience he used for everything. Stop arguing with the things I've already decided. She looked at him. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the fear and the impossible weight of the morning that was coming, she almost smiled. Is that what married life is going to be like? She said. You just deciding things quietly. Only the ones that matter, he said. They walked back to their horses, and somewhere in the cold, dark air between them, something shifted. Not love, it was too early and too complicated for that word. But something like trust. Something like the beginning of a thing that had no name yet, but was already quietly real. The marriage happened at 6:15 the next morning. Judge Harold Ferris owed Philip Crane a favor going back 12 years, the details of which Crane had never fully explained, and Eliza had the sense never to ask about. What she knew was that at 5:45 in the morning, Crane had sent a boy with a note, and by 6 o'clock, Harold Ferris was in his study, in his best vest, looking at Nathaniel Brooks and Eliza Carter across his desk, with the particular expression of a man who has seen every variety of human desperation and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. You understand this is a legal marriage, he said, not unkindly but plainly. Not a performance, not a temporary arrangement for court purposes. The law doesn't make that distinction. We understand, Eliza said. Mr. Brooks. Yes, Nathaniel said. Ferris looked at them both one more time. Then he opened his book. It took 4 minutes. Eliza had no flowers. Nathaniel had no ring. He had improvised with a plain band he'd had in a drawer, which fit her finger better than she expected, which she decided not to think about too closely. Crane stood at this, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing the night before, ink stains on his right hand. When it was done, Ferris closed his book. "Good luck today," he said. And then he added quietly in a way that was not part of any official proceeding, "I've heard things about Gerald Holt for years. I hope you stick him good." Eliza looked at the simple band on her finger in the gray morning light as they walked out. "How do you feel?" Crane asked her. "Terrified," she said honestly, "and strangely calm." "That's exactly how you should feel walking into a fight you might not win," he said. "We're going to win," Nathaniel said behind them. Both Eliza and Crane looked back at him. He was adjusting his coat with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already run the numbers and liked the result. "You don't know that," Crane said. "No," Nathaniel said. "But Holt doesn't know what we're walking in with, and I do." He met Crane's eyes. "That's enough." The courthouse was a two-story building on the north end of Casper's Main Street, and Gerald Holt arrived at 8:55 with two lawyers and an air of complete confidence that Eliza recognized immediately as a man who has bought his outcomes in advance and considers the proceedings themselves a formality. Howe was 61 years old, broad-shouldered with white hair, and the particular bearing of someone who had confused wealth with righteousness for so long that the two had become indistinguishable to him. He wore a coat that cost more than Eliza's horse. His lawyers moved around him the way water moves around a rock automatically without thought. He walked into the courthouse without looking at her. That small thing, the deliberate non-acknowledgement, steadied something in Eliza. It burned clean. She had expected to feel afraid when she saw him. Instead, she felt clear. She took her seat beside Crane and Nathaniel, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she watched Gerald Holt settle himself at the opposing table with the comfortable ease of a man making himself at home. And she thought, "You don't know what's in this room with you." That thought kept her steady for the next 40 minutes. The first 40 minutes were exactly what Holt expected. His lead attorney, a man named Devereaux, who spoke with the polished certainty of someone who had won arguments before the argument began, laid out the lien provision with practiced efficiency. He cited the 1881 Mineral Rights Amendment. He produced the original documents. He walked through the legal standing with the smooth assurance of someone who had done this before, which he had. Eliza watched the judge. She watched the way his eyes moved across the documents. She watched the slight tilt of his head that meant he was listening to Devereaux's logic and not finding reason to dispute it. She felt Nathaniel's knee touch hers under the table. Just for a second. Barely a contact. But it meant hold. She held. Then Crane stood up. "Your Honor," he said. "Before we respond to the provision in question, I'd like to introduce supplementary evidence that speaks directly to the nature and origin of the document Mr. Devereaux has just presented." Devereaux smiled. It was a careful, practiced smile, the smile of a man who had heard opposing counsel try to introduce last-minute evidence before. "Your Honor, if counsel intends to challenge the document's authenticity." "I intend to challenge a great deal more than that," Crane said. He was not smiling. He placed the first of Nathaniel's documents on the judge's bench. "What I intend to introduce is evidence of a systematic pattern of fraudulent instrument construction involving no fewer than 8 properties across Powder River County, all bearing the structural signature of the same originating hand." The room changed. Eliza felt it before she heard it, a shift in the air, something tightening. Devereaux's smile did not disappear, but it paused, which was more telling. At the other table, Gerald Holt had gone very still. That stillness was the first real thing he had done since walking in. Everything before it had been performance. This was something different. This was the stillness of a man processing an unexpected variable. "The amendment used to claim rights over Mrs. Brooks's water access," Crane continued, and Eliza registered the name with a small internal jolt she didn't have time to examine. "Was constructed using the same method, the same embedded provision structure, and in several cases the same language as 7 other instruments filed with this county between 1879 and 1884. I have chain of title documentation, original deed comparisons, and sworn correspondence that establishes not an isolated legal dispute, but a coordinated effort to deprive multiple ranch families of their property rights through deliberately obscured contract language. He set the documents on the bench one at a time, each one landing with its own quiet weight. Devereaux was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is an extraordinary claim with no foundation in the scope of today's hearing," the judge said slowly, looking at the documents in front of him. "Appears to have been rather significantly broadened, Mr. Devereaux." "Your Honor." "Sit down, please." Devereaux sat. At the other table, Gerald Holt leaned toward his second attorney and said something very quietly. The attorney's expression did not change, but his posture did. He sat straighter. He reached for his own papers. Eliza watched all of it. Then Crane said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Nathaniel Brooks to speak to the provenance of this evidence and his 6-year process of documentation." And Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the front of the room with the same unhurried steadiness he walked everywhere. He stood before the judge and looked completely, utterly calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid. The calm of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment and had no intention of wasting it. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Brooks, you collected this documentation personally?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Over 6 years?" "Yes." "And what motivated you to do so?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level and clear. "A neighbor of mine lost his water rights in 1881 through a provision almost identical to the one being used against the Carter Ranch today," he said. "Walt Pullman. Good man. 3 children. He was out of business in 2 years and out of the county inside of 5. I believed something wrong had been done to him, and I could not prove it then. But I believed it was not done to him alone." He paused. "So I started looking. Not because I knew what I would find, because I thought someone should be looking." The judge held his gaze. "And what did you find?" "I found 8 families," Nathaniel said. 8 families who lost property rights through instruments that appear legitimate on their face, but contain provisions that expand in scope in ways the signers could not have understood. In each case, the beneficiary of those provisions was the same entity, a land holdings company called Territorial Resource Partners, which is registered in the name of a trust, which if you follow the documents through leads back to Gerald Holt. The room erupted, not loudly. This was a courtroom, not a theater. But there was movement, heads turning, chairs shifting, a sharp sound from Devereaux that was halfway between an objection and something more personal. Holt himself said one word low and hard, and his attorney put a hand on his arm. The judge raised his hand, and the room quieted. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said carefully, "you're making a serious allegation." "I'm presenting documented evidence," Nathaniel said. "The allegation follows from the evidence. I didn't construct it, I found it." Eliza sat very still at the table. She watched Gerald Holt's face. For the first time since he had walked into that courtroom with his expensive coat and his practiced confidence, and his 2 lawyers arranged around him like armor. For the first time something had cracked in his expression. Not fear exactly, more like recalculation. Like a man staring at a map he had trusted completely and realizing very slowly that the territory has changed. He turned his head, and for the first time that morning, he looked directly at Eliza. She did not look away. She held his gaze across that courtroom, and she thought of her father, and of Walt Pullman, and his 3 children, and of every family whose name appeared in Nathaniel's 6 years of careful, patient, quiet documentation, and she did not blink. Holt looked away first. The judge called a recess. In the hallway, Crane grabbed Eliza's arm and steered her around a corner and said in a voice that was barely controlled, "He's rattled. Devereaux is going to request a continuance. I can almost guarantee it. They're not prepared for this. But we need to be ready for the possibility that—" "He's going to come at us now," Eliza said. Crane stopped. "What?" "Not legally. After." She kept her voice low. "If we've just put him in a position where he might actually lose, he's not going to wait for the judge's ruling. He's going to move against us directly." Crane looked at her, then at Nathaniel, who had come to stand beside her. "She's right," Nathaniel said. He's done it before. When the Hendersons started asking too many questions about their deed transfer, their barn burned down inside of a week. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're telling me this man is dangerous beyond his legal maneuvers?" "I'm telling you," Nathaniel said, "that we may have just made him feel cornered. And cornered men with money and connections don't file appeals. They find other ways." Eliza felt the cold clarity of that settle through her. She had walked into this morning thinking the courtroom was the battlefield. She was starting to understand it was only the first one. "What do we do?" Crane said. Nathaniel looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. In that moment, standing in a courthouse hallway with the sound of the recess conversation buzzing around them, with a judge considering evidence that could unravel a decade of fraud, with a powerful man in the next room recalculating how to destroy them. Eliza Carter, who was now technically Eliza Brooks, understood something that had not been in any of her planning or preparation. She had come to Nathaniel Brooks for his name, for his legal standing, for the practical architecture of a marriage as a tool. But standing beside him in this hallway, she realized she had found something else entirely. She had found someone who thought the way she thought. Someone who had been quietly angry about the same injustice for 6 years without anyone knowing. Someone who had prepared for this fight alone in the dark, with no guarantee it would ever matter, and had kept going anyway. She didn't know what to do with that yet. There was no time to figure it out. "We go back in," she said. "We finish what we started, and then we deal with whatever comes next." Nathaniel held her gaze. "Together," he said. It wasn't a question. "Together," she said. Crane looked between them, and whatever he saw in that exchange made him press his mouth together and nod in a way that suggested he was revising something he had thought about this marriage. They walked back into the courtroom. Devereaux did indeed request a continuance. The judge denied it. He did it cleanly, without drama, with the particular firmness of a man who has realized the proceeding in front of him is considerably more significant than it appeared on his docket that morning. "The evidence introduced today is substantial and credible on its face," the judge said. "This court is not inclined to allow a continuance that would give any party opportunity to adjust their position in response to documentation that should by rights have been discoverable in any proper preparation." He looked at both tables. "We will reconvene after the noon hour. I expect both counsels to be prepared to address the full scope of what has been introduced today." Holt stood. His lawyers were already moving, already talking, already building the architecture of whatever came next. But Holt himself stood still for one more moment, and he looked across the room one more time, not at Crane, not at Nathaniel, but at Eliza. And what she saw in his face in that moment was not anger. It was assessment. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have underestimated, recalculating its threat level, deciding what tools to reach for next. She held his look steady until he turned away. Outside in the cold noon air, with the hearing paused and the afternoon still ahead of them, Eliza stood on the courthouse steps and breathed slowly. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "You knew," she said. "When you said yes last night, you knew this was going to be bigger than a property hearing." "I suspected," he said. "Why didn't you say so?" "I thought about it." "Because you were already carrying enough," he said. "And because it didn't change what needed to happen. You still needed to fight. I still had the means to help you. The size of the thing didn't change the direction." She looked at him. 13 years older. A widower. A man of 4 words where 4 would do, who had spent 6 years walking a county, quietly collecting justice for people he barely knew, with no guarantee anyone would ever use it. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the marriage, not for the documents. For something bigger than either of those, something she didn't have the right words for yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have done the same for me," he said, "and he would have done it better." She felt that land somewhere deep. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think he would have been smarter about it. Just louder." Nathaniel made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Small, brief, but real. She had not heard him laugh before. It changed something in his face, made him look less like a monument and more like a person. She filed that away in a part of her that was already paying more attention than she'd given herself permission to acknowledge. "Come on," he said. "We have 3 hours before the afternoon session. Crane needs us." She followed him down the steps, and as she walked, she thought, "Whatever this is, whatever we are, it is the most honest thing that has happened to me in a very long time." She didn't say it, but she didn't push it away either. She let it walk alongside her in the cold afternoon air, unnamed and new and terrifyingly possible, as the courthouse door opened ahead of them, and the fight that was nowhere near finished pulled them both back inside. The afternoon session started at 1 o'clock, and Gerald Holt walked back in with 3 lawyers instead of 2. Eliza noticed immediately. Nathaniel noticed half a second after her. Crane noticed last, and when he did, he set his pen down on the table with a controlled precision that told her he was more unsettled than he wanted to show. The third lawyer was a man named Aldous Garrett Crane, identified him in a whisper the moment he walked through the door. Garrett was not a county attorney. He was not even a territorial attorney. He was a man who traveled from Chicago when the money was large enough and the stakes were serious enough, and his presence in a Casper courtroom on less than 12 hours' notice meant that Gerald Holt had made a phone call the previous evening that cost him considerably more than pride. "He brought in Garrett," Crane murmured. That's not a good sign." "It means he's scared," Eliza said. "It means he's resourced," Crane said. "There's a difference." Nathaniel said nothing. He was watching Garrett the way you watch a horse you don't know yet, taking the measure of it, not committing to a judgment, just observing. Garrett set his briefcase on the table, with the air of a man who billed by the quarter hour and considered every moment of theater a professional investment. He was perhaps 50, with close-cut gray hair and a face built for skepticism. The kind of face that had heard every argument and dismissed most of them and wore that history in its expression. He looked at Nathaniel's documents already entered into evidence. He looked at them the way a surgeon looks at another surgeon's work, dispassionately clinically searching for the cut that could undo it. Then he looked across the room at Crane, and he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man signaling that the real game was about to begin. Crane straightened his jacket. "Whatever he has," he said quietly, "hold your expressions, both of you. Don't react. Whatever he says, no reaction." "Understood," Nathaniel said. Eliza nodded. The judge called the session to order. Garrett stood immediately. "Your Honor, I have been retained by Mr. Holt to address several significant concerns about the evidence introduced this morning. Specifically," he paused, and the pause was theatrical timed, "the legitimacy and provenance of the documents themselves." Crane was on his feet in the same breath. "Your Honor, the documents are original instruments filed with this county over a period of 6 years. Their provenance is thoroughly. Their provenance," Garrett said pleasantly, not raising his voice, "is a single individual who spent 6 years collecting paperwork in private, with no legal standing, no professional qualification, and no chain of custody documentation that would satisfy any standard of evidentiary admission." The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Garrett, you'll have your opportunity. Mr. Crane, sit down." Crane sat. Under the table, his knee was bouncing. Eliza could feel it. "Mr. Garrett," the judge said, "make your argument." And Garrett did. How was good. Eliza had to grant him that. He was precise and methodical, and he used language the way a craftsman uses a fine tool. No wasted motion, everything in service of the cut. He challenged the chain of custody on 3 of Nathaniel's documents. He introduced a counter-affidavit from a county clerk, stating that 2 of the deed comparisons Crane had presented contained transcription discrepancies from the originals on file. He questioned Nathaniel's motivation and expertise, framing 6 years of careful documentation as the obsessive personal crusade of a man with a grudge and no credentials. He did not raise his voice once. He didn't need to. By the time he sat down, Eliza could feel the weight of the room shifting. Not dramatically, not enough for a stranger to notice. But she had been watching that judge's face all morning, and she could see it, the careful recalibration of a man who had been surprised once today and was now applying considerably more caution to everything that followed. Crane leaned toward her. "The transcription discrepancy is a problem. If 2 documents can be challenged, Garrett will use that to cast doubt on all of them. Are the discrepancies real? She asked. That's the question, isn't it? Crane said grimly. She looked at Nathaniel, who was very still. His hands were flat on the table. He was staring at a fixed point somewhere past the judge's bench, and his jaw was set in a way she recognized now. Not anger, but concentration. Like he was turning something over in his mind, running it from every angle. Nathaniel, she said quietly. He turned to her. The two documents he flagged, she said. The Pullman deed transfer and the Henderson mineral amendment. Do you have the originals? He blinked. Once. Not here, he said. Her stomach dropped. But, he said, and his voice stayed level. I know where the originals are. The real originals, not the county copies. She stared at him. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that the copies on file with the county were altered. Not by me. By whoever filed them. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Say that again, she said. The documents I have are correct, he said. The originals. The versions that were actually signed. The county copies were altered after filing the discrepancies. Garrett just identified are real, but they're not in my documents. They're in the county records. Crane had gone completely still. If that's true, Crane said very quietly, then Holt didn't just construct fraudulent instruments. He or someone working for him falsified official county records. Yes, Nathaniel said. Nathaniel. Eliza put her hand on the table between them, not touching his hand, just placing it there. How do you know this? He looked at her. Because I have copies of the originals as they were signed, he said. Not the county copies, the actual papers, the versions the families held before they were pressured to surrender them. He paused. Walt Pullman gave me his copy before he left the county. He said he didn't know if it mattered, but he wanted someone to have it. 2 other families did the same. He stopped again. I didn't know what the discrepancies meant until right now. Until Garrett just told me. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Crane said in the voice of a man who has just watched a losing hand become something else entirely. Where are those original documents right now? My ranch, Nathaniel said. In a lockbox under the floorboard in the tack room. Crane looked at the clock on the wall. Then at the judge who was engaged in a low conversation with his clerk. Then back at Nathaniel. I need those documents, Crane said. Today, before this session closes. My ranch is 8 miles out, Nathaniel said. I know where your ranch is, Crane said. He turned to Eliza. Can you ride? I've been riding since I was 4 years old, she said. Then go, Crane said. Both of you. I will keep this session talking as long as I can. Procedural objections, requests for clarification, anything I can manufacture. I need 2 hours. You can't manufacture 2 hours, Nathaniel said. Watch me, Crane said. And for the first time all day, there was something in his voice that was almost fierce. Go, now. While the judge is consulting with his clerk, stand up slowly. Don't run and go out the side door. Eliza and Nathaniel looked at each other. Go, Crane said again. They went. They did not run until they were outside, and then they ran. Nathaniel's horse was faster than Juniper, and they both knew it, but he kept his pace matched to hers, without her asking, which she noticed, without having time to acknowledge. The road to his ranch was familiar to her. Now she had ridden it twice in the last 12 hours, which felt impossible, and she bent low over Juniper's neck and let the horse have her head, and thought about nothing except the lockbox under the floorboard in the tack room and the 2 hours Crane had promised to buy them. Halfway there, Nathaniel pulled alongside her and said loud enough to carry over the sound of hooves, There's something else in that box. She looked at him sideways. What? A letter, he said. From Walt Pullman. Written the week he left the county. He told me what happened to him, not just the documents, the whole thing. Who approached him, what they said, what they threatened. He paused. He named Holt directly. She felt the air change in her lungs. A sworn statement, she said. Not formal, but it's in his hand, signed and dated. That's testimony, she said. That's a witness account. From a man who's been gone 5 years, he said. I don't know if we can find him. We don't need to find him today, she said. We need the letter today. They rode. The tack room was exactly as Nathaniel had described, which meant it was clean organized and contained exactly one loose floorboard third from the left wall under the saddle rack. Nathaniel had it up in under a minute. The lockbox was iron, the kind that had survived a decade of Wyoming winters without complaint. He produced a key from his coat pocket. It was on the same ring as his house key, which told her he had been carrying these documents close to him for a long time, and opened it. Inside were papers wrapped in oilskin, which was different oilskin from what he had brought to Crane's house the night before. These were older, handled more carefully. There were perhaps 20 pages, and on top of them, folded separately, was an envelope with N. Brooks written on the outside in a hand she didn't know, Walt Pullman's hand. Nathaniel looked at the envelope for a moment. Something moved across his face, something private that she didn't try to read. Then he took the papers and the letter, rewrapped everything in the oilskin, tucked it inside his coat, and stood up. "Let's go," he said. They made it back in 51 minutes. Eliza had never pushed Juniper that hard in her life, and she made a silent promise to the horse involving extra feed for a week. They came through the courthouse door still breathing hard, and Crane looked up from the middle of what appeared to be an elaborate and extremely tedious procedural argument about the admissibility standards for county document submissions, and the expression that crossed his face was the closest thing to relief Eliza had ever seen on a lawyer. "Your Honor," Crane said with the smooth pivot of a man who had been stalling masterfully and was delighted to stop, "I have additional evidence I'd like to introduce at this time." Garrett rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel cannot simply produce. Mr. Garrett," the judge said, "I've been listening to procedural argument for the better part of 2 hours. I'm going to look at whatever Mr. Crane has produced. Sit down." Garrett sat. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Crane laid the Pullman original documents side by side with the county copies. Even from the defense table, Eliza could see it. The difference was not subtle once you knew to look for it. A specific clause in the deed transfer, 5 words inserted into the county copy that were not in the original 5 words that changed the scope of the provision from a narrow mineral access right to something considerably broader. The judge looked at both versions for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at Garrett. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "can you explain this discrepancy?" Garrett's voice was still smooth. "Your Honor, without time to examine the alleged original, I cannot speak to its authenticity." "The alleged original," Nathaniel said from his seat. Everyone looked at him. He was not supposed to speak. He was not testifying. He was a party to the case sitting at the table, and he had said those 3 words in a voice so quiet and so level that for a moment the entire room absorbed them before anyone processed what had happened. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Brooks, I apologize, Your Honor." Nathaniel's voice did not carry the apology the way most men carried apologies. It carried it the way he carried everything, plainly without decoration. "What I should have said is that document was handed to me by Walt Pullman on the day he loaded his family's belongings into a wagon and drove away from land his father had settled. He told me he didn't know if it would ever matter. I told him I'd keep it." He paused. "It matters now." Something shifted in the courtroom. It was the kind of shift that happens when an argument stops being about law and becomes about something human beings recognize about a man keeping a promise to a neighbor who had been broken, keeping it for 5 years with no audience and no reward, just because it was the right thing to do. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to see the letter." Crane submitted the Pullman letter. The judge read it. Gerald Holt, for the first time, leaned across to Garrett and said something sharp and urgent in a low voice. Garrett listened and gave a short, careful response. Holt pulled back. His expression was controlled, but his hands, Eliza noticed, were flat on the table, now pressed down in a way that spoke of effort. The judge looked up from the Pullman letter with an expression that had traveled a long distance from where it had been that morning. "Mr. Devereaux," he said. "Mr. Garrett, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Were you aware prior to this hearing that the county copy of the Pullman deed transfer contained language not present in the executed original?" Devereaux and Garrett exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second. "Your Honor," Garrett said, "my client has a right." I'm not asking your client, the judge said. I'm asking you. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Eliza counted them. No, Your Honor, Garrett said. We were not aware. The judge looked at him steadily, in a way that indicated clearly he had formed his own conclusion about that statement, and did not intend to share it publicly. This hearing is in recess, he said. I am ordering an immediate review of the county records pertaining to all property instruments connected to the entities named in Mr. Brooks's documentation. That review will be conducted by an independent examiner appointed by this court. No property transfer rights assignment or instrument execution connected to these matters will proceed pending that review. He looked at both tables. If any party attempts to act on any claimed right currently under challenge before this review is complete, they will be in contempt of this court. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor, Crane said. He was working hard to keep his voice neutral and not entirely succeeding. Garrett said nothing. Holt said nothing. The gavel came down. It was not a victory. Eliza understood that clearly Crane had already told her twice not to mistake a recess for a resolution. The review would take time. Garrett would spend that time building counter-arguments. Holt had resources she couldn't fathom. This was not over. But in the hallway, when the doors closed behind them and Crane turned around, his eyes were bright with something she hadn't seen in him before. 8 families, he said. 8 families who were told there was nothing to be done. 7, Nathaniel said. The Carters make 8. Crane looked at him, then at Eliza. I owe you both an apology, he said. They were, Eliza said. I told you to consider surrendering. She was quiet. I know what you told me, she said after a moment. You were telling me what the law looked like from the outside. You weren't wrong about what you saw. I was wrong about what I didn't see, Crane said. He looked at Nathaniel. I didn't see 6 years of preparation standing in the same county as my client. Nathaniel just looked back at him. How did you know to start collecting? Crane asked. Back in 1881, what made you look past the Pullman situation and think there was something larger? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Because Holt came to me first, he said. Crane and Eliza both went still. Before Pullman, Nathaniel said. Before any of the others. Holt's man came to my property in the spring of 1880 with a grazing agreement that I was supposed to sign quickly and not read carefully. He looked at his hands. I read it carefully. I didn't sign it. And 2 weeks later the approach stopped. He paused. I always assumed he moved on to easier targets. Later I understood that Pullman was one of those targets. You were the first one he tried, Eliza said slowly. The first one who didn't comply, Nathaniel said. I think that's what started it for me, the wondering. If I'd been easier to pressure, if I'd been younger or more in debt or less suspicious by nature, I'd have signed that paper. And I'd have been one of them. His voice was completely even. I never forgot that. It felt like luck or grace or something I hadn't earned. And luck you haven't earned feels like a debt. The hallway was quiet. So you spent 6 years paying it, Eliza said. He met her eyes. I spent 6 years waiting, he said. Until someone came along brave enough to make it matter. She felt that land in her chest like something heavy and warm. She wanted to say something back, something equal to it. She opened her mouth and nothing came that was large enough, so she closed it again. Then she said the only true thing she had, my father was right about you. Something moved in Nathaniel's face, something old and quiet. I hope so, he said. I'd like to have deserved that. They stood in that hallway, the 3 of them, with the courthouse noise around them, and a fight that was nowhere near finished. And Eliza felt beneath all of it, beneath the fear, and the uncertainty, and the exhaustion of a night without sleep, and a day without mercy. Something she had not felt in 14 months. She felt her father's absence differently. Not as a gap, not as a wound, but as a presence, quiet, steady, like something looking over her shoulder with recognition. You found the right man, she could almost hear him say. Took you long enough. She almost laughed. Then Crane said, Holt is still in that building, and in approximately 10 minutes, he's going to walk out those doors and make a phone call, and whatever happens next is going to happen fast. And just like that, the moment broke open into the urgency of what was still ahead. Because Eliza had been right in that hallway hours ago. Cornered men with money didn't file appeals. They found other ways. And Gerald Holt, who had spent a decade building a quiet empire on the wreckage of other people's land, had just been handed the worst day of his professional life by a woman and a quiet rancher that no one had thought to watch. He was not going to accept that quietly. Eliza knew it. Nathaniel knew it. They looked at each other across the hallway, and in that look was everything that didn't need to be said, that they had fought the first battle and had not lost, and that the war was not over, and that whatever came through the door next, they would meet it the same way they had met everything today. Standing next to each other. Not rescue, not dependence. Something harder and cleaner than either of those words. Partnership. The phone call Holt made lasted 6 minutes. Crane knew this because he had a contact inside the telegraph office. A young clerk named Eddie Marsh, who had once had a debt situation that Crane had quietly resolved, and who had been quietly useful on several occasions since. Eddie sent a boy to Crane's office within the hour with a folded note that said, "Only H called Chicago, called county sheriff, called bank." Crane read the note twice, then held it over his lamp until it caught fire. 3 calls, he told Eliza and Nathaniel when they came to his office that evening. He set the note's ash in his ashtray. Chicago means Garrett is being instructed to pursue every available legal challenge simultaneously: appeals, counterfilings, jurisdictional challenges. That part we expected. He paused. The county sheriff is more concerning. Sheriff Aldred, Nathaniel said. The way he said the name was not quite neutral. Crane looked at him. You know him. I know he's taken Holt's money before, Nathaniel said. Nothing I could prove. But 2 years ago, when the Henderson barn burned, Aldred closed the investigation inside of a week. Called it an accident. He paused. The Hendersons told me they'd seen one of Holt's hired men near the property the night before. Eliza felt the familiar cold clarity settle through her. He's going to use the sheriff to pressure us, she said. Possibly something more direct than pressure, Crane said. He looked at her steadily. I want you both to understand what we may be walking into. What was manageable as a legal dispute has become something else. Holt is not accustomed to being cornered publicly. He's going to retaliate, and he's going to do it in ways that the law will be slow to address. The bank call, Nathaniel said. Which bank? Territorial Savings, Crane said. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. That's her note, he said. The Carter Ranch note. Yes, Crane said. Eliza looked between them. He's calling in the note. He's going to try to accelerate it, Crane said. The legal review protects your water rights from transfer, but it does not freeze your financial obligations. If Territorial Savings calls the note early, claims a technical default on some buried provision in your loan agreement, then the ranch faces foreclosure on a separate track entirely, one that the court review doesn't touch. The room was quiet for a moment. Can he do that? She asked. If the bank cooperates, Crane said. And if Holt has enough of a relationship with the lending officers, which given that Territorial Savings has financed half of his development ventures. He does, Nathaniel said flatly. Eliza stood up. She did it without drama. She just stood up, walked to the window, stood with her back to both of them for a moment. She breathed carefully the way she had been breathing carefully for the past 48 hours, in through the nose, slow forcing her heartbeat to something manageable. She thought about her father, about the kitchen table where he had sat 30 years ago with nothing but a piece of land and a plan, about the fence posts he had set himself one by one over decades, about the graves on the hill behind the house, her mother's, then his own, about everything that was buried in that ground. She turned back around. What do we need, she said, to get ahead of the bank? Crane looked at her. If there's any irregularity in the original loan instrument, any provision that was misrepresented when your father signed, we could challenge the note's terms. But I'd need to review the original paperwork tonight. I have it, she said. At the ranch. In the strongbox in my father's study. Then we go get it, Nathaniel said. He was already standing. There's something else, Crane said. Both of them stopped. The independent examiner the judge appointed, his name is Samuel Greer. He's a territorial records official out of Cheyenne. I know him. He's honest, which is exactly why Holt is going to try to discredit him or delay his appointment before he gets started. He paused. I need someone to ride to Cheyenne and talk to Greer directly. Tonight. Before Holt's Chicago attorneys can reach him first. Eliza and Nathaniel looked at each other. Cheyenne is 5 hours, Nathaniel said. I know, Crane said. That's both of us riding in separate directions at the same time, Eliza said. I know that too, Crane said. He looked genuinely pained. I would go myself, but I need to be here to monitor the bank situation and prepare the counter-filing for any accelerated note claim. He met her eyes. I'm asking a great deal. You're asking us to split up, Nathaniel said. Yes. Another look between them. Different from the looks they'd been exchanging all day, this one carried something more personal. Something that had grown in the past 20 hours without either of them quite agreeing to let it happen. I'll go to Cheyenne, Nathaniel said. I know the road, and Greer is more likely to take the documents seriously coming from the person who collected them. I'll go back to the ranch, Eliza said. Get the loan papers, and I'll stay there tonight. You're not staying there alone, Nathaniel said immediately. I've been staying there alone for 14 months, she said. That was before you publicly cornered a man who burns barns, he said. The air between them went taut. Crane cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks. Eliza, she said automatically. Eliza. He chose his words. He's not wrong. One person alone on an isolated property tonight is... I'll take my rifle, she said. Eliza. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, but it carried something she hadn't heard in it before. Not authority. Not command. Something more unguarded than that. I know you can handle yourself. I know you've been handling yourself. That's not what I'm saying. He stopped. I'm saying I don't want you out there alone tonight. That's not about capability. That's about I just don't want it. The room was very quiet. She looked at him. His face was completely open in a way she hadn't seen. The careful steadiness was still there, but beneath it something honest and undefended. She made a decision. Is there anyone who can stay at the ranch with me? She asked Crane. Someone trustworthy. My nephew James, Crane said immediately. He's 22, he's solid, and he has no connection to anyone in this situation. I'll send him tonight. She looked at Nathaniel. Will that do? It'll do, he said. But she heard in it that it wasn't what he wanted, and she filed that away in the same place she'd been filing everything about him for the past 20 hours. Go to Cheyenne, she said. Talk to Greer. Get him moving before Garrett does. I'll be back by morning, he said. I know, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded, picked up his coat, and left. Crane watched the door close. How long have you known him? He asked. 48 hours, Eliza said. He looked at her. Approximately, she said. He turned back to his papers, but not before she caught the expression on his face, something between surprise and recognition, and something that might, in a different kind of man, have been called tenderness. Let's look at those loan documents, he said. She rode back to the ranch with Crane's nephew James, who was indeed solid, a broad-shouldered young man of very few words, who rode well and asked no questions, and who, when they arrived, simply took up a position by the front door, with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had been told what needed doing and intended to do it. Eliza went directly to her father's study. The strongbox was where it had always been, behind the third volume of a surveying manual on the bottom shelf. A hiding place her father had been so proud of that he had shown it to her twice and expected her to act surprised both times. She had loved him for it. She opened it with the key she kept on a ribbon inside her boot, which was a precaution her father had taught her, and which she had followed every single day since his death, without fully understanding why until now. Inside were papers she had looked at before the deed. The original land patent, her parents' marriage record, her own birth record. And at the bottom, folded in a different way from everything else, the loan agreement with Territorial Savings Bank dated March 1879. She spread it on the desk and began to read. She was methodical about it. She had learned that from her father, who had said once that the difference between being cheated and not being cheated was almost always whether you read something twice. She read the loan agreement twice. Then she read it a third time, specifically looking for what Crane had described. Buried provisions, technical default triggers, anything that Holt could use through the bank to accelerate the note outside the legal protection the court review provided. She found it on page 4. A single clause, buried in a paragraph about collateral valuation. A provision that allowed the lending institution to call the balance of the note in full, if in the institution's assessment, the collateral value was materially impaired by, and here was the language, legal dispute or governmental action affecting clear title. She read it again. Her mouth had gone dry. The court ordered review. The review that was supposed to protect her. Under this clause, the bank could argue that the existence of that very review constituted a legal dispute affecting clear title, which meant they could call the full note due immediately, which meant she sat back in her father's chair. The trap was extraordinary. Use the court action to trigger the bank clause. Use the bank clause to destroy the ranch financially before the court action resolved in her favor. She would win the legal battle and lose the war. She sat there in the dark for exactly 2 minutes, feeling the full weight of it. Then she stood up, folded the document carefully, tucked it inside her coat, and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. She was not going to solve it tonight. Crane would need to see it. There would be a way, there was always a way, as long as you didn't stop looking for it. She had learned that too from her father. But she was not her father. She had learned something he hadn't had the opportunity to teach her because she had learned it in the past 48 hours from a man who kept a lockbox under his tackroom floor for 6 years, against the possibility that it might someday matter. She had learned that you didn't have to solve everything alone. She drank her coffee. She sat by the window. James was a quiet presence outside, unhurried and reliable. And the night passed slowly, but it passed without incident. At 6:23 in the morning, she heard a horse. She was at the door before the knock came. Nathaniel looked like he had ridden through the night without stopping, which he had. He was cold and tired, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than she had seen them, and he was carrying something in his expression that she couldn't read yet, something that was either very good or very bad. "Greer," she said immediately. "On his way," Nathaniel said. "Left Cheyenne at 4 this morning. He'd already received a communication from Garrett's office trying to question his appointment. He wasn't happy about it." Something almost like satisfaction moved across Nathaniel's face. Samuel Greer is not a man who responds well to being pressured. "Good," she said. She held the door open wider. "Come in. I need to show you something." She showed him the bank clause. He read it once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. She watched his face and recognized what was happening on it because she had gone through the same sequence the night before: the processing, the recognition, the assessment of how bad it was. "He's going to use this," Nathaniel said. "I know. Crane needs—" "I know. I'm writing to him as soon as you've eaten something." She was already at the stove. He looked at her. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." "I'm used to longer nights," he said. "So am I," she said. She set a cup down in front of him without asking. He looked at it, then at her. "Eliza," he said. She turned back to the stove. "I've been thinking," he said on the road, "about the arrangement." She kept her hands moving. "What about it?" "I want to be honest with you," he said. "About what I said to Crane last night. About not wanting you out here alone." He paused. That wasn't purely a safety concern. She was very still. Her back was still to him. "I know," she said quietly. "I want to be clear about what it was," he said. "Because you came to me in a desperate situation, and you are a woman of considerable intelligence and capability, and the last thing I want is for you to feel—" "Nathaniel." She turned around. "I know what it was." He looked at her. "I have known you for 48 hours, she said. "I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. What I know is that nothing about the last 2 days has been what either of us expected." She held his gaze. "What I don't know is what to do with that yet, but I'm not confused about what it is." He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were around the cup. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was something quieter and more honest than either of those, an acknowledgement between two people who had been through a great deal together very fast and were choosing consciously not to run from what had accumulated. She turned back to the stove. "There's something I haven't told you," he said. She waited. "Clara, my wife," he said. "She died of fever in the winter of 1881. Same winter the Pullman situation happened." He stopped. "I threw myself into the documentation partly because I needed something to do with the anger. After she died, I needed something that required me to pay attention to details and not to my own grief." She turned around again. She looked at him. "What was she like?" she asked. He seemed surprised by the question, like he had expected a different response. "Quiet," he said. "Funnier than she looked. She had strong opinions about horses and almost no opinions about anything else, which made her very pleasant to live with." Something soft and worn moved across his face. She would have found this entire situation completely absurd and then rolled up her sleeves and helped. Eliza felt something open in her chest. "She sounds wonderful," she said. "She was," he said. "Simple, uncomplicated. The grief of a man who had processed it into something clean and livable." "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. "Thank you," he said. He meant that too. They looked at each other in that kitchen in the early morning light, with everything that had happened between them in 48 hours, sitting in the air. The desperate knock on his door, the marriage, the courthouse, the ride to Cheyenne. The thing he had said about not wanting her alone, and now this, his dead wife's name, and the way he had said it, and the way she had asked, and the fact that neither of them had looked away. Then hooves outside. 2 horses moving fast. James's voice. "Mrs. Brooks' rider's coming." She and Nathaniel both moved at the same time. Outside, men she didn't recognize were pulling up at the gate. Not threatening in posture, not yet, but one of them was holding a folded paper that had the look of an official document, and the other was wearing a badge. Sheriff Aldred's badge. Not Aldred himself. A deputy. But Aldred's office. Nathaniel stepped out beside her. She felt him there without looking, that steady, quiet presence that she was already in ways she hadn't fully admitted depending on. The deputy looked at both of them. "Mrs. Brooks." He looked between them uncertainly. "That's me," Eliza said. "I have a notice here from Territorial Savings Bank." He held up the paper. "Formal notification of a request for early assessment under loan provision 14 section C. You'll want to have your attorney review this." She took the paper. She did not open it. She already knew what it said. She looked at the deputy. "Thank you," she said. "Tell whoever sent you that my attorney will be in contact with the bank before noon." The deputy nodded. He looked at Nathaniel for a moment, the careful, assessing look of a man who was passing along a message. He maybe didn't entirely feel comfortable delivering, and then he turned his horse and rode away. Eliza stood in the morning air with the bank notice in her hand. She looked at it. Then she held it out to Nathaniel. He took it, read the relevant provisions. His jaw tightened once. Then he folded it and handed it back. "They moved fast," he said. "Holt moves fast when he's afraid," she said. He looked at her. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm angry." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition like hearing a note he'd been waiting for. "Good," he said. "Angry is useful. Angry means you're not done." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not done," she said. "I know," he said. "I never thought you were." They went inside, and Eliza sat down at her father's desk, which she had been avoiding without realizing it, treating it like sacred ground, his territory, and not hers. And she sat in his chair fully. This time not perching at the edge, but sitting back the way he had sat, and she pulled a piece of paper toward her and began writing a list of everything she needed Crane to address before noon. Nathaniel sat across the desk and watched her write. "You look like him," he said quietly, "when you sit at that desk." She didn't stop writing. "People have said that." It's a compliment of the highest order, he said. She stopped writing. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, open look. The one that had no performance in it, no calculation, nothing strategic. Just a man looking at a woman and saying what he saw. He'd like you, she said. He'd pretend to have reservations, because that's how he was with anyone he respected. He'd ask you about your cattle operation, and your fence line, and your opinion on the territorial water law, and about an hour in, he'd stop pretending and start talking to you like a neighbor. She paused. That was the highest honor he had to give anyone. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Tell me more about him," he said. So she did. Not because there was time for it, there wasn't, but because something in the past, 48 hours, had taught her that some things were worth making time for, even when the world was pressing in, and one of those things was speaking the names of the people you loved to someone who was genuinely willing to hold them. She talked for 20 minutes about her father, about the way he'd taught her to read a property survey, about the time he'd argued for 2 hours with a county official about a boundary marker and turned out to be wrong and apologized without any drama whatsoever, about the morning he'd told her very quietly that she was more capable than she allowed herself to believe, and that whoever she chose to let into her life had better understand that clearly. Nathaniel listened to all of it. He didn't fill the silences. He didn't redirect or summarize. He just listened the way she was learning was his most fundamental mode of being in the world. When she finished, he said, "He told you that you were more capable than you allowed yourself to believe." "Yes," she said. "He was right," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "And whoever he thought you might choose," Nathaniel said carefully. "I'd like to think he wouldn't be too disappointed." The air between them held that for a moment. Then she said just as carefully, "No, I don't think he would be." It was not a love scene. It was not dramatic or physical, or the kind of moment that announces itself. It was two people in a farmhouse kitchen, exhausted and afraid, and in the middle of a fight they hadn't yet won, saying true things to each other with the particular honesty that only comes when you've been through enough together. Together that pretense has stopped being worth the energy. It was something better than a love scene. It was real. Then Crane knocked on the door. He came in looking like a man who had not slept and had found something important in the process. He set 4 documents on the table. "The bank clause," he said, and Eliza was already pulling it out to show him, and he shook his head. "I know about the bank clause. I found its origin." He tapped the top document. That clause was inserted into Carter Ranch loan agreements in 1882 as a modification that was never signed by your father. Eliza went very still. "What?" "The modification was filed with the bank's internal records, but was never executed by the borrower," Crane said. His voice was controlled and bright with a particular kind of fury. "It was added unilaterally. It has no legal standing." He looked at both of them. Holt didn't just falsify county property records. He had someone inside Territorial Savings alter loan documents. The room absorbed that. "He's been doing this for years," Nathaniel said. It was not surprise in his voice. It was the sound of confirmation, 6 years of suspicion finally finding its full shape. "Longer than we knew," Crane said. "And Samuel Greer, who arrived in Casper 40 minutes ago, is going to be very interested in this." He paused. "As is the Territorial Attorney General's office, to whom I have already sent a telegraph." Eliza looked at Crane, at Nathaniel, at the documents on the table, and she understood with the particular clarity of a moment when everything shifts that they had crossed something. Not a finish line, not yet, but a threshold. They had moved from survival into something with the unmistakable shape of justice. It was not over, but it was for the first time genuinely winnable. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Nathaniel's. Not tentative, not performed, just a hand on a hand. Two people in the same fight, choosing to acknowledge it with something physical, because words weren't quite enough. He turned his hand over under hers. That was all. That was everything. "Let's finish this," she said. Samuel Greer was not what Eliza had expected. She had imagined a territorial records official from Cheyenne to be the kind of man who existed primarily in relationship to paperwork. Careful, dry, professionally neutral to the point of emotional absence. What walked into Crane's office at 9 o'clock that morning was a man of perhaps 60, with a white beard, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades watching powerful people try to manipulate official processes and had developed a deep personal and entirely unprofessional hatred of it. He shook Eliza's hand first, then Nathaniel's. He looked at the documents spread across Crane's desk and did not touch them immediately. He just looked at them the way a man looks at a fire he is deciding whether to walk into. I received 3 separate communications yesterday, attempting to question my appointment, he said without preamble. One from an attorney named Garrett, citing procedural irregularity. One from a county commissioner I've known for 15 years, who suddenly found reasons to doubt my objectivity. And one, he paused, from someone in the territorial governor's office, suggesting that the scope of this review might be better handled by a different examiner. The room was quiet. "What did you do?" Crane asked. "I packed my bag and rode here before dawn," Greer said. "Because in 30 years of this work, the only time 3 separate parties try to remove me, before I've looked at a single document, is when what I'm about to look at is very, very bad." He finally touched the papers. "Show me everything." They showed him everything. Nathaniel walked him through the 6 years of documentation with the same methodical patience he'd used in the courtroom. No drama, no editorial commentary. Just the evidence in chronological order, with the connections made clear. Greer listened without interrupting, which Eliza had already learned was the sign of someone who was genuinely absorbing rather than waiting to respond. When Nathaniel finished, Greer was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "The county record alterations. I'll need independent confirmation from the original signatories or their estates." "Walt Pullman is in Nebraska," Nathaniel said. "I have an address. The Henderson family is still in the county. Ruth Henderson, the widow, she kept her copy of the original deed." Greer looked at him. "You know she kept it." "I told her to keep it," Nathaniel said. 4 years ago." Greer took off his spectacles, cleaned them, put them back on. It was the action of a man processing something that required a moment. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I want to be very direct with you. What you have done 6 years of independent documentation, preserving original instruments, maintaining a chain of custody advising affected parties to retain their records, is more thorough than anything my office would have produced if we'd been officially tasked with this investigation from the beginning." He paused. "I want to know why you didn't bring this to anyone sooner." It was the same question Crane had asked. Nathaniel's answer was the same in substance, but carried something different. Now, something that had been clarified by everything that had happened in the past 2 days. "Because I needed someone with standing to use it," he said. "And because I needed to trust that whoever I brought it to was fighting for the right reason, not for settlement, money, not for political advantage, not for anything that would let Holt negotiate his way to a lesser consequence." He looked at Eliza. "I needed someone who just wanted the truth on record, regardless of the cost." Greer followed his gaze. He looked at Eliza for a moment. "The cost to you personally has been considerable," he said to her. "It hasn't finished being costly," she said. "No," Greer said. "It hasn't." He opened his case and took out his own papers. "I'm going to need to move quickly. Garrett will file a challenge to the review scope in territorial court by this afternoon. If I know his playbook, and I need to have preliminary findings documented before that challenge can be heard. That means I need access to the county records office this morning with a court-authorized examiner's order." He looked at Crane. "Can you get me that order within the hour?" "Within 40 minutes, Crane said. He was already reaching for his coat. "Then let's not waste the 40 minutes, Greer said. What followed was the most concentrated, pressurized 6 hours of Eliza's life. Crane went to the court for the examiner's order. Greer went directly to the county records office with Nathaniel, who had every document cross-referenced in his memory, with the precision of a man who had been mentally organizing them for 6 years. Eliza went to find Ruth Henderson. She rode to the Henderson property alone. James offered to come, but she shook her head. This was not a situation for company. Ruth Henderson was a woman who had lost her husband to illness 2 years after losing her property rights to Gerald Holt, and Eliza had a sense based on nothing more than what Nathaniel had told her and her own understanding of what that kind of loss felt like, that Ruth would respond better to one woman at her door than to a group. She was right. Ruth Henderson was in her mid-50s, small and economical, in her movements with the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who has stopped expecting help and organized her entire existence around not needing it. She opened her door, looked at Eliza and said, "You're the Carter girl." "Yes, ma'am." "I heard what happened at the courthouse yesterday." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I heard Nathaniel Brooks brought documents." "He did," Eliza said. "He's been collecting them for 6 years. Your property records are part of what he has." She paused. "There's an examiner from Cheyenne reviewing everything right now, but he needs confirmation from the original signatories. He needs your copy of the original deed." Ruth was very still. "I have it," she said. "I know. Nathaniel told me he asked you to keep it." Something moved across Ruth's face. "He came to me after my husband passed," she said. 3 years after we lost the water access. He came and he sat in my kitchen and he told me to keep that deed in the safest place I had, and not to tell anyone about it, and not to let anyone convince me it didn't matter." She stopped. "He told me he didn't know when it would matter, just that it would." Eliza stood at Ruth's door and felt the full weight of 6 years of quiet faithfulness moving through her. "Did you believe him?" she asked. "I didn't not believe him," Ruth said. "Nathaniel Brooks is not a man who says things he doesn't mean." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, I'll get it." The deed was in a tin box wrapped in cloth inside a flower bin, which Ruth acknowledged with the faintest possible shadow of a smile, was her own version of creative security. It was in perfect condition. Every word was legible. The contrast between Ruth's original and the county copy. When Eliza laid her photograph of Greer's preliminary county record next to it was immediate and unmistakable. 5 words. Inserted in the county version. 5 words that did not exist in the document Ruth Henderson had signed. Ruth looked at both versions for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "He changed it." "Someone acting for him," Eliza said. "We don't know exactly who made the alteration, but the investigation, he changed it," Ruth said again. Not louder, not more emotional, just more certain. Like she had suspected it for years and had never had the proof, and now the proof was in her kitchen and it felt exactly as she had imagined. "My husband went to his grave believing he hadn't read it carefully enough, believing he'd missed something, that it was his fault." Her jaw tightened. "He blamed himself until he died." Eliza was quiet. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. She let the silence hold what it needed to hold. Then Ruth Henderson straightened her back, picked up her deed and said, "Where do I need to go?" They arrived at the county records office to find it in a state of controlled chaos. Greer had been there for 2 hours and had already identified 4 separate instruments with alterations consistent with the Pullman and Henderson documents. The county clerk, a man named Douglas Farr, who had held the position for 11 years, had gone from cooperative to increasingly pale over the course of the morning as the scope of what Greer was finding became apparent. 2 of Holt's men had appeared outside the records office at 11 o'clock and had been standing there since without entering, which Greer had noted once added to a written record he was maintaining and otherwise ignored. Nathaniel met Eliza and Ruth at the door. He looked at Ruth Henderson, and something in his face shifted, the same thing that had shifted when Eliza had mentioned her father, that private movement of old feeling meeting present moment. "Ruth," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. She looked at him for a moment. "You were right. You said it would matter." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." "You kept your word," she said. "That's enough." She walked past him into the records office, and Nathaniel watched her go, and Eliza stood beside him and watched him watch her, and she understood something clearly in that moment. This was not just about her ranch. It had never been just about her ranch. For Nathaniel, it had been about Ruth and about Walt Pullman loading his family into a wagon, and about 6 years of carrying other people's losses alongside his own grief quietly, without account or audience. She touched his arm. He looked at her. "Come on," she said. Greer needs the cross-references. He nodded, and they went in together. At 12:40 in the afternoon, Garrett arrived. He came with a territorial court order faster than any of them had anticipated, which meant Holt had mobilized more resources overnight than Crane had estimated. The order was narrow. It challenged the scope of Greer's examination and demanded that any evidence collection be suspended pending a jurisdictional hearing. Garrett presented it to Greer with the smooth confidence of a man who had been playing this particular move his entire career. Greer read it, set it down, picked up his own document, the examiner's order Crane had obtained that morning, and laid it beside Garrett's. "Mr. Garrett," Greer said pleasantly, "your order challenges the scope of a standard territorial records examination conducted under authority granted by the presiding judge of this county's district court. The challenge requires a jurisdictional hearing at the territorial level, which I agree will need to happen." He paused. "However, it does not require me to suspend an examination already in progress. The order you've presented speaks to scope going forward. It has no authority over findings already documented." He tapped the folder beside him, thick, already substantial, growing thicker by the hour. "Anything I have found prior to this moment is in the record. That record does not pause." Garrett's smooth confidence did not disappear, but it recalibrated. "Mr. Greer." "I'm going to continue working," Greer said. "You're welcome to observe. Any challenge to my methodology can be raised at the jurisdictional hearing, which I will attend personally and with considerable documentation." He turned back to the county records spread across the table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Garrett." Eliza watched Garrett's face for a fraction of a second. So brief, she might have missed it. Something cracked. Not defeat, just the recognition of a man who has hit an obstacle he didn't predict. He turned and walked out. Nathaniel was standing beside her. "He's going straight to Holt," he said. "I know," she said. "What does Holt do when the legal route closes?" She thought about the Henderson barn, about what Nathaniel had said in the courthouse hallway. "He finds another way. Then we need to be ready," Nathaniel said. He looked at Crane, who had heard the exchange. Crane was already reaching for his hat. "I'm going to the sheriff's office," Crane said. "Not Aldred. Above Aldred. The territorial marshal has a deputy stationed in Casper, a man named Cole, who is not on anyone's payroll but his own. I've been saving that conversation for the right moment." "Is this the right moment?" Eliza asked. "Holt just burned through his most expensive legal move in one afternoon," Crane said. "Yes, this is the right moment." He left. Greer worked until 4 o'clock. By the time he set his pen down, he had documented 6 altered county instruments, confirmed the Henderson and Pullman originals as authentic, and established a pattern of alteration that bore the consistent signature literally in the form of a specific style of interlinear insertion of the same hand. "The same person made every alteration," Greer said. He was not excited about this. He said it the way a doctor announces a diagnosis soberly, with the weight appropriate to the information. Over a period of at least 6 years, someone with access to the county records office systematically altered filed instruments to expand the scope of rights claimed under Gerald Holt's various entities. Eliza looked at Douglas Farr, the county clerk, who had been sitting in the corner of his own office for the past 3 hours with the expression of a man waiting for an earthquake. Farr felt the look. He looked up. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was almost inaudible. "I swear to God I didn't know." "Who had access to the records after hours?" Greer asked him, not unkindly. Farr swallowed. "3 people. Me, my deputy clerk, and—" He stopped. "And," Greer said. "The county commissioner," Farr said. "Commissioner Reeves. He has a standing key. Has had one for 8 years." The room absorbed that. Eliza thought of the 3 communications Greer had mentioned receiving the previous day. One from Garrett. One from a county commissioner Greer had known for 15 years. She looked at Greer. He met her eyes. "Commissioner Reeves," he said quietly, "was the second communication I received." There it was. The full shape of it. Not just Holt. Not just Holt's lawyers. A county commissioner with a key to the records office, 8 years of access, and a relationship with Gerald Holt that had made all of it possible. This goes beyond Holt, Nathaniel said. Considerably, Greer said. Reeves has been in that office for 12 years, Ruth Henderson said from the doorway. She had been quietly present all afternoon, helping where she could, saying very little. He was the commissioner when my husband signed his deed. She paused. He attended my husband's funeral. Nobody said anything. Ruth walked to the table, looked at Greer's documentation, and then looked up. Is this enough? She asked. Not hopefully. Not desperately. With the straightforward practicality of a woman who has stopped hoping and started calculating. For a criminal referral to the Territorial Attorney General, Greer said. Yes, we were already past sufficient this morning. He began organizing his papers. This afternoon moves it from sufficient to overwhelming. It was at that exact moment that Crane came back through the door. He was breathing faster than usual. His hat was in his hand. Holt is leaving, he said. Every head turned. Marshal Cole's deputy picked up information within the hour, Crane said. Holt has a private rail car that he uses for travel between Wyoming and Chicago. It's being prepared at the Casper rail yard right now. Departure is scheduled for 6 o'clock. Eliza felt something cold move through her. He's running. He's done it before, Nathaniel said. His voice was flat and certain. In 1883, when a land dispute in Johnson County got close to finding him, he went to Chicago for 3 months and came back when it had settled. Once he's across the territorial line, the Attorney General's referral gets complicated, Greer said. He was already on his feet. Interstate jurisdiction, federal involvement, months of procedural delay. He looked at Crane. I need to file the preliminary findings with the court right now. If we can get a temporary order restricting Holt from leaving the territory while the criminal referral is active. How long will it take? Eliza asked. Crane and Greer looked at each other. 2 hours minimum, Crane said, to draft file get before a judge. He's leaving in 2 hours and 20 minutes, Eliza said. 20 seconds of silence. Then Nathaniel said, Marshal Cole's deputy. Is he here? Outside, Crane said. Does he have authority to delay a departure pending criminal referral proceedings? Crane blinked. If the referral is formally initiated. What does formally initiated require? Nathaniel said. At minimum. Crane looked at Greer. A signed preliminary finding statement from the examining official submitted to the court, Greer said slowly, which I can produce in 20 minutes. And a sworn statement from a party directly harmed, Crane said, catching it, which establishes standing for the referral. Everyone looked at Eliza. She was already moving toward the table. Give me a pen, she said. She wrote her sworn statement in 14 minutes. Her hand was steady. Her words were plain and specific, and she did not embellish a single thing because the truth laid out plainly was more than sufficient. She signed it with her full name, Eliza Brooks née Carter, and dated it and slid it across the table to Crane. He read it in 2 minutes. This is good, he said. This is very good. Greer finished his preliminary findings at the same time. They went out together, all of them, because there was no reason to split up now, and every reason to move as a single body, to where Marshal Cole's deputy, a lean man named Briggs, who looked like he had heard everything in his career and retained the capacity to be surprised by very little, was waiting beside his horse. Crane handed him both documents. Briggs read them with the economical attention of a professional. He looked up. You're asking me to delay Gerald Holt's departure pending criminal referral proceedings, he said. Formally requesting, Crane said. Under Territorial Statute, 14 Section. I know the statute, Briggs said. He handed the documents back. I'll need to keep the originals. Crane produced copies. Anticipated, he said. Briggs took the originals, put them in his coat, and looked at all of them assembled on the street. Gerald Holt is the most powerful man in this county, he said. Not as a challenge, as a statement of fact that he was apparently checking their awareness of. He's been the most powerful man in this county for long enough, Nathaniel said. Briggs looked at him. Something passed between them, the look of two men who have both in their different ways been paying attention to something most people preferred not to see. I'll go to the rail yard, Briggs said. He mounted his horse. I suggest you go directly to the judge. They went directly to the judge. Judge Ferris, who had started this particular chapter of his career the previous morning, believing he was presiding over a routine property hearing, looked at what was placed before him at 4:55 in the afternoon with the expression of a man encountering the full consequence of having called for an independent review. He read for 8 minutes without speaking. Then, the commissioner, Reeves. "Yes, Your Honor," Greer said. Ferris set the documents down very carefully, the way you set down something that might break. "I've known Daniel Reeves for 20 years, he said. Nobody said anything. "He attended my wife's birthday dinner last spring," Ferris said. Still nobody said anything. Ferris sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back down, his expression had completed its journey from shock to something harder and more resolved. "Mr. Greer," he said, "your preliminary findings are accepted by this court. The criminal referral to the Territorial Attorney General is authorized." He reached for his pen. "And I am issuing a temporary order restricting all named parties from departing the territory pending the outcome of that referral." He signed it. He handed it to Crane. "Get that to Marshal Cole's deputy," he said. "Now." They got it to Briggs at 5:22. Gerald Holt's private rail car was sitting on the tracks at the Casper rail yard, with steam already building, when Briggs rode up, dismounted, walked to where Holt was boarding, and handed him the court order. Crane heard this account second-hand through Briggs an hour later. He relayed it to Eliza and Nathaniel sitting in his office with coffee going cold in their cups. Holt read it, Briggs had said. "Read it twice, looked at me, asked if I understood who he was." Briggs's account was flat and economical. "I told him I understood exactly who he was, and that the court order didn't make exceptions for that. He asked to speak to his attorney. I told him he was welcome to speak to his attorney on the platform, and that the train was not going to move until I received confirmation from the court that the order had been served." Crane paused. "What did Holt say?" "He said," Briggs had paused here, "he said, this wasn't over." Crane relayed this to Eliza and Nathaniel. Eliza wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He's right," she said. "It's not over." "No," Crane agreed. "The Territorial Attorney General investigation will take months. Garrett will challenge everything. Reeves will lawyer up. There will be hearings and counterfilings and delays." He looked at both of them. "I want to be honest with you. The legal process from here is long. But the water rights," Eliza said. "The court order protecting them is in place," Crane said. "The bank modification is invalidated. I have written confirmation from a territorial savings director who, once the criminal referral was filed, was remarkably eager to clarify that the modification had been made without proper authorization." He paused. "Your ranch is safe, Eliza. The note is on its original terms. The water rights are protected. That part is done." She sat with that for a moment. Done. Her father's ranch was safe. She had expected to feel something enormous at those words, something that required an outward expression, tears or relief, so physical it bent you forward. Instead, what she felt was quieter and deeper than that. Like water returning to its proper level after a long disturbance. Like something settling back into place that had been displaced for 14 months. She put her cup down. She looked at Nathaniel. I was watching her with that same open steadiness, reading her the way he read everything, without hurry, without projection, just seeing what was actually there. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that your father built something worth fighting for, and that you fought for it." He paused. "And I'm thinking that what we do next is up to you." The room was very quiet. Crane discovered something pressing to attend to in the other room. "The arrangement," Eliza said. "You've been a man of your word about all of it. If you wanted to, if you needed to step back from—" "I don't," he said. "You haven't let me finish." "You were going to offer me a way out of the marriage," he said. "I don't want one." She looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said, "we have known each other for 3 days." "I know. Most people would say that's not enough time to—" "Most people," he said, "haven't spent 3 days like the ones we've just had." She was quiet. He leaned forward. His voice was still low, still unhurried, but there was nothing held back in it now. "I said yes when you came to my door because you were your father's daughter. And because I'd been waiting 6 years to give those documents to someone worth giving them to, he said. But I want you to know whatever comes next, whatever you decide. What happened between us in the past 3 days is not something I would trade for a simpler version of events. Not any part of it. He paused. You asked me once why I said yes. That's the full answer. She looked at him across the table in Crane's office. She thought about the woman who had ridden through the dark 3 nights ago, with nothing but desperation and a plan that had 3 men already turned it down. She thought about what she had expected from that night, the best possible outcome she had allowed herself to imagine, and she held it up against what had actually happened. There was no comparison. I'm not asking you for a way out, she said. I want to be clear about that. He held her gaze. I know. But I am going to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said. The ranch is going to need work, she said. The south pasture fencing is 2 seasons overdue. The cattle operation needs rebuilding. The water system needs infrastructure that I've been deferring because of the legal situation. She kept her voice practical and even. It's going to take a long time to get it back to what it should be. Longer still to make it what it could be. I know ranching, he said. You have your own operation, she said. My operation runs well with a hired hand and some attention, he said. I'm not saying abandon it. I'm saying the 2 properties together managed as one interest. He stopped. I've thought about this, Eliza. I've thought about it since about 4 o'clock yesterday morning on the road to Cheyenne. She almost smiled. What did you decide? I decided, he said, that I'd like to come home to the same place you do. The simplicity of it landed on her like something completely unexpected from a direction she hadn't guarded. She had been prepared for grand gestures, for complicated proposals, for negotiated arrangements and careful conditions, and the elaborate protective architecture that people construct when they are afraid of wanting something directly. He had said, I'd like to come home to the same place you do. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. She looked back up at him. That, she said, is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. I'm an honest man, he said. I know, she said. That's the whole reason I knocked on your door. He looked at her. Something in his face that was fully and unmistakably now something she could call warmth. So, he said. So, she said. They sat there grinning at each other across Crane's table, like 2 people who had survived something extraordinary and discovered in the surviving of it something they hadn't gone looking for and weren't going to let go of. Crane came back into the room. He looked at them. He looked at the ceiling. I want you both to know, he said, that I became a lawyer because I believed in justice and the rational application of law, and nothing about the past 3 days has resembled that in any way, and I have never been more grateful for a case in my professional life. He sat down. Also, I need you to sign 3 more documents. They signed the documents. 6 weeks later, Ruth Henderson received a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office confirming that she was among the parties named in a formal fraud investigation against Gerald Holt and County Commissioner Daniel Reeves, and that remediation of her property rights was among the proceedings under review. She brought the letter to Eliza's kitchen and set it on the table, and sat down and cried for the first time, she said, since her husband's funeral. Eliza sat across from her and didn't say anything. She put her hand over Ruth's, and she let her cry, and she thought about her father, who had told her once that the 2 most important things you could do for another person were tell them the truth and stay in the room. She stayed in the room. Walt Pullman was found in Nebraska on a small operation he had built from nothing after losing his Wyoming property. Nathaniel wrote to him. The letter took 2 weeks to arrive and another 2 weeks to receive an answer. When the answer came, Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table. Eliza's kitchen table, which had become his kitchen table, in the incremental and practical way that 2 people's lives merge when they are both too sensible and too tired for dramatic declarations. And he read it once quietly, and then he folded it and held it in both hands for a moment and didn't say anything. She waited. He says, Nathaniel said that he has not been back to Wyoming in 5 years because he didn't believe there was anything to come back to. He paused. He says if it's real, he'd like to see it with his own eyes. Tell him to come, Eliza said. He looked at her. Tell him to come. she said again. In the spring. We'll have the south pasture finished by then. There'll be room. He looked at her for a long moment. You know this is going to become a thing, he said. One man comes, then another. People hear that someone fought back and won, and they start to think it might be possible. Good, she said. Let them think that. It's true. He watched her. You've changed, he said. Not as a criticism. As an observation, the kind he made quiet and accurate, the way he noticed everything. Have I? She said. You came to my door 3 weeks ago, prepared for me to say no, he said. You'd prepared yourself for every version of this failing. You were brave enough to try anyway, but you were carrying all of it alone, and you'd gotten used to that. He paused. You're not carrying it alone anymore, and you know it. That's different. That's a different way of standing in the world. She sat with that. She thought about the woman on horseback in the dark, riding toward a light in a window, almost turning back twice. She thought about what it had taken, not bravery exactly, or not only that. Something more specific. The willingness to knock on a door when you had already been turned away from 3 others. The willingness to ask one more time from one more person, even knowing the most likely answer was no. And the faith not blind. Faith not irrational faith, but the kind that comes from knowing one true thing about a person and deciding to bet on it. The faith that the man who had once warned her father quietly without asking for anything in return was the kind of man worth asking. She had been right. You're different too, she said. He raised an eyebrow. You spent 6 years waiting to give those documents to someone, she said. You knew what they were worth, and you kept them under your floor, and you waited. That's a particular kind of patience. She looked at him. You're not waiting anymore. He considered that. No, he said. I'm not. Gerald Holt's legal battles took 14 months. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation expanded beyond Wyoming into a 3-state inquiry that involved 4 other landholding companies and 11 other county officials across the territory. Commissioner Reeves cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, which Eliza thought was insufficient, and said so once to Crane, who agreed with her, and said that the cooperation had broken open parts of the scheme that would otherwise have taken years to establish, and that sometimes insufficient accountability was the price of complete accountability for those above him. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Holt himself was found guilty on 6 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy in a proceeding that lasted 3 weeks and generated reporting in newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco. He was sentenced to 7 years and ordered to pay restitution to each of the affected families, amounts that were in most cases inadequate to what had been lost, but which were the largest fraud restitution awards the territory had seen, and which Greer told her would be cited in territorial law for decades. She sat in that courtroom on the final day. Nathaniel sat beside her. Ruth Henderson sat on her other side. Behind them in the gallery were faces she recognized from documents and letters and second-hand accounts, the adult children of Walt Pullman, who had come from Nebraska, the younger Henderson son who had grown up watching his family lose everything, and who was now 21 and starting something of his own. 2 families whose names had appeared in Nathaniel's documentation, who Eliza had not previously known. When the verdict was read, the room was very quiet. Then Ruth Henderson exhaled a long, slow breath, and Eliza heard in it the weight of more than a decade. Not just Ruth's decade, all of their decades. The accumulated years of losing and fighting and being told there was nothing to be done, and then finding against every reasonable expectation that there was something to be done, that there had always been something to be done, that it had been waiting in a lockbox under a floorboard for 6 years. She felt Nathaniel's hand cover hers. She turned it over and held on. Outside the courthouse in the clean winter air, Walt Pullman's son, a young man named Thomas, named for a grandfather he'd never met, who bore no relation to Eliza's father, except the coincidence of the name, came up to Nathaniel and stood in front of him for a moment. "My father wanted me to tell you something," Thomas Pullman said. He was maybe 19, with the look of a young man who had been carrying a message carefully and was relieved to finally deliver it. "Go ahead," Nathaniel said. "He said I gave you that deed not knowing if it would ever matter. You kept it for 12 years. You kept your word." He paused. He said to tell you that means more to him than the restitution, more than any of it. He looked at Nathaniel steadily. He said some men keep their word when it costs them nothing. You kept yours when nobody was watching, and you had no reason to. Nathaniel was very still. Tell your father, he said, that his deed is what made all of it possible. He's the one who gave me something worth keeping. Thomas Pullman nodded. He shook Nathaniel's hand. He shook Eliza's. He walked away with the particular straightness of a young man who has received something from the world that he intends to carry forward. Eliza watched him go. You should have told him more, she said to Nathaniel. You should have told him what it meant to you, what all of it meant. He knows, Nathaniel said. Not everyone is as good at knowing what isn't said as you are, she said. He looked at her. Fair point, he said. And then I'll write to Walt directly, when we get home. Home. He said it without noticing, or perhaps he noticed and chose not to remark on it, which was the same as Nathaniel. The words sat in the air between them like something completely natural, like it had always been true and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be said plainly. The Carter Ranch, which Greer's assistant had taken to calling the Brooks property in official documents, and which Eliza had been correcting every time, until Nathaniel suggested quietly that maybe both names together was closer to the truth, and she had thought about it and agreed, came through the winter in better shape than it had seen in years. Nathaniel had been right about the two operations together. Not just financially, though, that too, which mattered more than Eliza had allowed herself to admit when she was carrying it alone, but in the daily work of it. The way two people who understood land and cattle, and the particular stubbornness required to keep both, could do together what neither could do half as well alone. He fixed the south pasture fencing across 3 weeks in early spring with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, and she worked alongside him and did not ask him to explain his process, because she had learned he had a process, and it was better than offering alternatives, and he did not offer opinions on how she ran the kitchen ledger, because he had learned she had a system, and it was accurate. They had arguments. Not many, but real ones about the North Water Line placement, about whether to take on a particular cattle contract. Once a genuinely heated disagreement about a hire that lasted 3 days and resolved in her favor, and which he acknowledged without drama and without resentment. That last one told her something important. A man who can be wrong about a hire and say so clearly is a man you can trust across 30 years. She thought that often in the first year. She would catch herself calculating things in terms of 30 years. The fence that needed replacing and how long a good replacement would last. The young trees she planted along the property's east edge that wouldn't provide real windbreak for a decade. The cattle breeding program she was rebuilding, which wouldn't reach its full potential for 6 or 7 years. She had started thinking in terms of time she had not yet lived, and she knew what that meant. It meant she had stopped preparing to lose and started planning to build. In the spring, Walt Pullman came. I was older than she'd imagined. Late 50s, weathered in the specific way of men who have done hard physical work for decades and then had to do it again from scratch somewhere else. He came with his son Thomas and his wife, a small, quiet woman named Agnes, who took one look at the ranch and said nothing for a long moment, and then said to Eliza, "You kept it." "My father kept it first," Eliza said, "and then I kept it." "That's how things survive," Agnes said. "Someone always keeps them." Walt Pullman stood on the land that had once been adjacent to his own and looked around for a long time. Nathaniel stood with him. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. They were two men who had been present at the same injustice from different positions, and who had both in their different ways held on to something through the years when holding on seemed pointless. Later at the kitchen table, Walt said, "I'd like to come back." "To Wyoming," Nathaniel said. "The restitution is enough to start something modest," Walt said. "Not what we had, but something." He looked at Eliza. "You think there's land available, near here?" She thought of the property on the east side, the Henderson tract which Ruth had decided to sell at the end of the previous year. She thought of what she had said to Nathaniel when he'd mentioned that Walt might come. People hear that someone fought back and won, and they start to think it might be possible. "I know of something," she said. "Give me a week to make a call." He gave her a week. She made the call. The details took a month. The paperwork took 3, and in the fall of the following year, Walt Pullman came back to Wyoming with his wife and son, and a modest stake, and started something new on land adjacent to where he had started something the first time. His son Thomas eventually took over the operation. He ran it well. But that was later. That was the future accumulating itself the way futures do not, in dramatic moments, but in choices made and kept in debts, honored in words, said plainly to people who were listening. What Eliza knew, standing in her father's kitchen, hers now hers, and Nathaniel's, in the late light of an early spring afternoon, watching him come in from the south pasture with mud on his boots, and that same unhurried steadiness in his walk that she had first seen by lantern light on a November night 3 years ago, was this. She had ridden through the dark with nothing left. She had knocked on a door not knowing if it would open. She had asked for the one thing she never imagined asking of a man she barely knew, and he had said yes without hesitation, and without conditions, and without asking what was in it for him. She had come to him looking for a name, a legal shield, a practical arrangement for a desperate situation. She had found a man who had been keeping faith quietly and without audience for 6 years before she arrived. A man who had said yes, not because the arrangement benefited him, but because a woman was willing to fight for something true, and he believed that was worth standing beside. A man who fixed fences and listened before speaking, and kept his promises to people who couldn't hold him to them. She had found in the middle of the worst year of her life the best thing in it. And she knew with the same clarity she brought to land surveys and cattle counts and loan documents and all the other true things in the world that this was not luck. It was the product of one desperate act of courage on a cold November night, and one man's willingness to answer a knock at the door without first calculating the cost. She had asked for a chance. She had found a family. The woman who had ridden through the storm asking "Marry me before it's too late" had not known what yes would cost her, or what it would give her, or how completely it would change the shape of her life. She knew now, and she would not have traded a single hard day of it for anything easier.